In the shadowed corridors of Buckingham Palace, where centuries of tradition echo through marble halls, a single decision would shatter the very foundations of royal protocol. Captain James Mitchell had spent 15 years of his life protecting the crown, his unwavering loyalty earning him the highest honor, personal guard to Princess Charlotte. But when the unthinkable happened, when the beloved princess found herself stripped of her royal title in a scandal that rocked the monarchy to its core, this decorated soldier faced an impossible choice. Would he stand by the institution that had shaped his entire adult life, or would he follow his conscience and protect the woman who had become more than just his duty? In a world where loyalty to the crown is absolute and personal feelings are considered treason, Captain Mitchell's decision would not only end his military career, but expose secrets that the royal family had desperately tried to bury. This is the true story of love, betrayal, honor, and the price of standing up for what's right when the entire world is watching. It's a tale that begins in the glittering ballrooms of royal society and ends in the quiet dignity of a man who chose his heart over his career, his conscience over his commission. What you're about to read will challenge everything you thought you knew about royal protocol, personal sacrifice, and the human cost of living in the public eye. This is not just a story about a princess who lost her title or a guard who gave up everything. This is a story about the moment when duty and love collide, and the extraordinary courage it takes to choose the harder path. The morning of October 15th started like any other in the life of Captain James Mitchell. At precisely 0600 hours, his alarm pierced the silence of his modest apartment near Wellington Barracks. The routine that followed had been perfected over 15 years of military service. Shower, shave, press his uniform to perfection, and prepare for another day of protecting one of the most beloved members of the British royal family. Princess Charlotte had always been different from the other royals James had protected during his career with the household division. Where others maintained the expected distance and formality, Charlotte possessed a warmth that made even the most seasoned palace staff feel at ease. She remembered birthdays, asked about family members, and showed genuine concern for the well-being of those around her. It was this very humanity that had made her the people's princess, beloved by millions across the Commonwealth. As James made his way through the palace corridors that Tuesday morning, he noticed an unusual tension in the air. Palace staff hurried past with worried expressions, and hushed conversations stopped abruptly when they spotted his approach. Something was wrong, but in the carefully controlled environment of royal protocol, information traveled slowly and deliberately through official channels. Princess Charlotte's private secretary, Margaret Thornfield, was waiting outside the princess's private apartments when James arrived for his morning briefing. Margaret's usual composed demeanor showed cracks of strain, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a manila folder against her chest. In 23 years of royal service, James had never seen the unflappable Margaret look so shaken. The princess herself emerged from her apartments at exactly 0800 hours, as was her custom. But today, instead of her usual bright smile and cheerful greeting, Charlotte's face was pale and drawn. Her eyes, normally sparkling with mischief and intelligence, were red-rimmed and haunted. She moved with the practiced grace that years of royal training had ingrained, but James could see the effort it required. The day's schedule had been mysteriously cleared except for one appointment that sent chills down James's spine, a private audience with Her Majesty the Queen at 1500 hours. In royal parlance, such sudden private audiences were rarely good news. They were the kind of meetings that preceded major announcements, public apologies, or in the worst cases, exile from royal duties. As they traveled through London that morning for what would turn out to be Charlotte's final official engagements as a working royal, James couldn't shake the feeling that he was witnessing the end of an era. The princess maintained her professional composure during a visit to a children's hospital, but James noticed how she lingered with each young patient, as if trying to memorize their faces. The breaking point came during their return journey to the palace. Charlotte's mobile phone rang, and James watched in his rearview mirror as her face crumpled upon hearing the voice on the other end. Through his earpiece, he could hear her end of the conversation, disjointed phrases about responsibility to the crown, unavoidable circumstances, and the greater good. When she finally hung up, Charlotte sat in silence for the remainder of the journey, staring out the window at the London streets she had served so faithfully. Back at the palace, rumors began to solidify into disturbing reality. James learned from his superior officer that tabloid newspapers had been contacted by Palace Communications with an embargoed story, one that would break the following morning and change Princess Charlotte's life forever. The details were scarce, but the implications were clear. Charlotte was about to become the center of a scandal that would force the royal family to take drastic action. The afternoon audience with the Queen lasted exactly 47 minutes. James waited outside the private drawing room, watching senior palace officials hurry past with grim expressions. When Charlotte finally emerged, she walked with the mechanical precision of someone moving through a nightmare. Her face was ashen, and she clutched a small velvet box in her hands, the box that had contained her royal insignia. That evening, as James maintained his post outside Charlotte's apartments, he could hear the sound of packing from within. Suitcases were being filled, personal belongings sorted, and a life carefully constructed within the confines of royal duty was being dismantled piece by piece. The princess's lady-in-waiting emerged several times throughout the night, carrying boxes to waiting cars that would transport Charlotte's possessions to an undisclosed location. The full scope of the crisis became clear when James was summoned to an emergency briefing at 2200 hours. His commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Hawthorne, delivered the news with military precision but obvious discomfort. Princess Charlotte would be stripped of her royal title effective immediately. She would retain no official duties, no public role, and no claim to the privileges and protections that came with her position. Most importantly for James, she would no longer require royal protection. The reason for this dramatic action remained classified, but rumors swirled through the palace like wildfire. Some whispered about financial impropriety. Others suggested a romantic scandal involving someone deemed unsuitable by royal standards. The truth, as James would later discover, was far more complex and heartbreaking than any of the gossip suggested. As the night wore on, James found himself facing an impossible situation. His duty as a member of the Royal Protection Unit was clear: protect the royals assigned to his care. But Charlotte would no longer be royal. His oath of service was to the crown, not to individuals who fell from grace. Protocol demanded that he step back, allow the transition to proceed smoothly, and accept his next assignment with the same professionalism he had always demonstrated. But Princess Charlotte wasn't just another assignment. Over the years of protecting her, James had witnessed her genuine compassion, her tireless work for charitable causes, and her unwavering dedication to serving the British people. He had seen her comfort grieving families, inspire disadvantaged youth, and bring joy to countless lives through her public engagements. The idea that such a person could be cast aside so completely seemed fundamentally wrong. The final straw came at 0300 hours when James received word that Charlotte would be leaving the palace at dawn, alone, and without any form of official protection. She would be driven to a private residence in the countryside, where she would remain while the royal family dealt with the fallout of her disgrace. For someone who had lived her entire adult life under constant protection, the sudden isolation represented not just a practical danger, but a profound psychological shock. James stood at his post through the remaining hours of darkness, wrestling with a decision that would define the rest of his life. He thought about his father, who had served in the same regiment, and taught him that honor meant more than following orders. He considered his mother, who had raised him to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. Most importantly, he thought about Charlotte, who in a few hours would walk out of the only life she had ever known with no one to ensure her safety or well-being. As the first rays of dawn broke over London, James made a choice that would shock the royal household and end his military career. He would not stand aside and watch a good woman face her darkest hour alone. He would not allow protocol to override his conscience or duty to override decency. Whatever consequences awaited him, James Mitchell decided that some things mattered more than following orders. The sun rose on what would become one of the most controversial decisions in modern royal history, and James prepared to face the storm that his choice would unleash. At exactly 0615 hours, James Mitchell walked into Colonel Hawthorne's office and placed his resignation letter on her desk. The document was brief, professionally worded, and gave no hint of the emotional turmoil behind his decision. Colonel Hawthorne read it twice before looking up at James with a mixture of disappointment and understanding. The colonel had served in the Royal Protection Unit for over 20 years and had seen dedicated officers struggle with the human cost of their duties. But She had never witnessed such a direct challenge to the established order. James was not just resigning. He was making a statement that would reverberate through the entire royal household. Within minutes of submitting his resignation, James received word that his security clearance was suspended and his access to palace grounds would be terminated at 0800 hours. The royal machine moved with ruthless efficiency when dealing with perceived threats to its carefully maintained order. James had exactly 1 hour and 45 minutes to collect his personal belongings and say his goodbyes. The news of his resignation spread through the palace faster than wildfire. Fellow protection officers stopped him in corridors, some expressing quiet support, others voicing concerns about the precedent he was setting. The palace staff, who had worked alongside James for years, watched with a mixture of admiration and anxiety as he methodically cleared out his office. Margaret Thornfield found him packing his final box of personal items. The princess's former private secretary looked as if she hadn't slept in days, her usually immaculate appearance showing signs of the stress that had consumed the royal household. She spoke in whispers, constantly checking to ensure they weren't overheard. Margaret revealed details that painted a picture of a scandal far more complex than the rumors suggested. Princess Charlotte hadn't committed any crime or moral transgression in the traditional sense. Instead, she had fallen victim to a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to remove her from the line of succession. The truth centered around Charlotte's growing influence and popularity, which had begun to overshadow other members of the royal family. Her charitable work had drawn international attention, and her modernizing approach to royal duties had won her millions of supporters worldwide. More concerning to certain palace traditionalists was her vocal support for progressive causes and her willingness to speak out on social issues. The final trigger had been Charlotte's decision to publicly support a controversial housing initiative for refugees. This stance, while popular with the general public, had angered powerful political figures and traditionalist members of the royal family who believed royals should remain strictly apolitical. When Charlotte refused to retract her support or modify her position, the decision was made to manufacture a scandal that would force her removal. The fabricated controversy involved manipulated financial records that suggested Charlotte had misused charitable funds for personal expenses. The evidence was sophisticated enough to convince a casual investigation, but would not withstand serious scrutiny. However, the royal family strategy relied on Charlotte accepting exile rather than fighting the allegations and subjecting the monarchy to the damaging publicity of a prolonged investigation. As Margaret finished her revelation, James felt his anger building to dangerous levels. The woman he had protected for years wasn't just innocent of wrongdoing. She was being sacrificed to protect an institution that couldn't tolerate her humanity and compassion. The irony was devastating. Charlotte was being punished for the very qualities that made her beloved by the public. James's final hour at the palace was spent in a whirlwind of administrative procedures designed to sever his connection to royal service. His weapons were returned to the armory, his identification badges surrendered, and his oath of secrecy reinforced through a series of legal documents that threatened severe consequences for any breach of confidentiality. The most difficult moment came when James had to surrender his ceremonial sword, a symbol of his years of faithful service and the pride he had taken in protecting the royal family. As he handed the weapon to Colonel Hawthorne, both of them understood that this wasn't just the end of a career, it was the end of a way of life that had defined James's entire adult identity. At 0800 hours precisely, James walked out of the palace gates for the final time as a member of the Royal Protection Unit. The media, already gathering for what they sensed was a breaking story, snapped pictures of the departing officer without understanding the significance of what they were witnessing. Princess Charlotte was scheduled to leave the palace at 0900 hours, and James positioned himself at a discreet distance to observe her departure. When her car finally emerged from the palace grounds, he could see her silhouette in the back seat, sitting alone and staring straight ahead. The woman who had once commanded motorcades and official escorts now traveled with only a driver, her fall from grace complete and devastating. James followed at a distance as Charlotte's car made its way through London traffic toward the countryside. He had no official authority or protection training that legally allowed him to monitor her movements, but he couldn't simply abandon someone who had become more than just an assignment over the years of service. The destination turned out to be a modest cottage in the Cotswolds, far from the grandeur of royal residences, but offering the privacy and isolation that Charlotte now required. James watched from a nearby hill as she was dropped off with only 2 small suitcases, a far cry from the extensive retinue that had once accompanied her everywhere. For 3 days, James maintained his informal surveillance of the cottage, sleeping in his car and living on convenience store food. He told himself he was simply ensuring Charlotte's safety during her vulnerable transition period. But the truth was more complex. He couldn't bear the thought of someone who had dedicated her life to serving others facing this crisis completely alone. On the 4th day, his vigil was interrupted by the arrival of reporters who had somehow discovered Charlotte's location. Within hours, the quiet country road was lined with news vans and photographers equipped with telephoto lenses. The peaceful refuge that had been intended to help Charlotte process her dramatic change in circumstances became another battleground in the media war surrounding her disgrace. James watched helplessly as photographers climbed trees and perched on walls, trying to capture images of the fallen princess. The cottage had no security measures beyond basic locks and curtains, leaving Charlotte essentially trapped inside her own temporary home. When evening fell and the reporters showed no signs of leaving, James made another decision that would further complicate his already precarious situation. Under cover of darkness, he approached the cottage and knocked gently on the back door. When Charlotte answered, her surprise at seeing him quickly gave way to relief and gratitude. For the first time since her ordeal began, she wasn't completely alone. Charlotte invited James inside, and they sat in the small kitchen while she made tea with shaking hands. The simple domestic scene was a stark contrast to the formal protocols that had governed their previous interactions. Here, stripped of titles and uniforms, they were simply 2 people trying to navigate an impossible situation. Charlotte spoke for the first time about the pain of her exile, the betrayal she felt from family members who had sacrificed her to protect the institution, and her fear about what the future might hold. She had lost not just her title and duties, but her identity, her purpose, and her connection to the only life she had ever known. James listened without judgment, offering the kind of honest support that Charlotte had been denied throughout the crisis. Palace officials had approached her exile as a management problem to be solved, but James saw it for what it really was, a human tragedy requiring compassion and understanding. As they talked through the night, both James and Charlotte began to understand that they were facing this crisis together, bound by circumstances that had forced them both outside the established order. James had given up his career to follow his conscience, while Charlotte had lost everything for refusing to compromise her principles. In their shared exile from royal life, they found an unexpected alliance. The next morning brought new challenges as the media presence intensified, and local police arrived to manage the growing crowd of reporters. James realized that his presence at the cottage would soon be discovered and would likely create additional complications for Charlotte. His unofficial protection detail was becoming untenable, and he needed to find a more sustainable way to ensure her safety. The solution came from an unexpected source. Margaret Thornfield contacted James through encrypted channels, offering information about a network of former royal staff members who had been quietly providing support to Charlotte behind the scenes. These individuals, bound by loyalty rather than duty, had been working to ensure that Charlotte's basic needs were met while she navigated her new reality. This underground support network included former palace security personnel, retired staff members, and even some currently employed individuals who were risking their careers to help someone they respected and admired. James's decision to resign and follow Charlotte had not only been noticed by these individuals, it had inspired them to take their own stands against what they saw as an unjust situation. As the second part of this extraordinary story drew to a close, James found himself at the center of something larger than his individual decision to resign. He had become part of a quiet rebellion within the royal household, a group of people who believed that loyalty to principles mattered more than loyalty to institutions. The consequences of this growing movement would soon test everyone involved in ways they never could have imagined. The safe house in rural Gloucestershire looked like any other converted barn from the outside, but inside it housed a sophisticated operation that would have impressed even the most seasoned intelligence operatives. Margaret Thornfield had led James here through a series of careful maneuvers designed to avoid media attention and palace surveillance. The barn served as headquarters for what its members called the Loyalty Network, a group of current and former royal staff members who had become increasingly disturbed by the treatment of Princess Charlotte. The network included protection officers, household staff, private secretaries, and even a few members of the royal communications team who had grown disgusted with their role in manufacturing Charlotte's downfall. David Chun, a former palace chef who had served the royal family for 12 years before his abrupt dismissal for budget reasons, served as the network's coordinator. His dismissal had actually resulted from his refusal to provide false testimony about Charlotte's alleged misuse of household funds. David's intimate knowledge of palace operations and his connections throughout the staff hierarchy made him invaluable to the growing resistance movement. The network operated with military precision, using encrypted communications and coded language to coordinate their activities. Members were compartmentalized to minimize security risks, with only a few individuals knowing the full scope of the operation. James was amazed to discover that the network had been monitoring Charlotte's situation since before her official exile, anticipating the need for independent protection and support. Sarah Walsh, a former lady's maid who had worked closely with Charlotte for 7 years, had been documenting evidence of the conspiracy against the princess. Sarah possessed a photographic memory and had kept detailed records of conversations, meetings, and decisions that revealed the calculated nature of Charlotte's destruction. Her evidence painted a picture of a deliberate campaign that had been months in the planning. The network's technical specialist was Kevin Morrison, a former communications technician who had maintained the palace's security systems. Kevin had become suspicious of unusual modifications to surveillance equipment in Charlotte's quarters and had begun secretly recording the activities of those he suspected were involved in framing her. His evidence included audio recordings of planning sessions and video footage of documents being altered. As James learned more about the network's discoveries, he began to understand the true scope of the conspiracy against Charlotte. The operation involved not just disgruntled family members and traditionalist courtiers, but also external political figures who saw Charlotte's progressive stance as a threat to their interests. The housing initiative for refugees that had triggered the final crisis was just the latest in a series of positions that had made Charlotte enemies in powerful circles. The financial evidence used to justify Charlotte's exile had been created through a sophisticated manipulation of palace accounting systems. Legitimate charitable expenditures had been reclassified as personal expenses, receipts had been altered, and false documentation had been inserted into official files. The scheme was designed to create enough apparent evidence to justify immediate action while being complex enough to discourage detailed investigation. Margaret revealed that several members of the royal household had approached her privately to express their concerns about the treatment of Charlotte. These individuals were afraid to speak out publicly due to the potential consequences for their careers and families, but they were willing to provide information and assistance to the network's efforts to support Charlotte and document the truth. The network had established multiple safe houses throughout the British countryside, each equipped with secure communications equipment and staffed by trusted former palace employees. This infrastructure allowed them to move Charlotte between locations when media pressure became too intense, ensuring her safety while maintaining operational security. James's military background and protection experience made him a valuable addition to the network's capabilities. His knowledge of surveillance techniques, threat assessment, and defensive strategies helped improve Charlotte's security situation significantly. More importantly, his decision to publicly resign in protest had provided the network with a powerful symbol of principled resistance. Charlotte herself had been unaware of the network's existence until James brought her to the safe house. Her reaction to learning about the support system was a mixture of gratitude and amazement. She had spent weeks believing she was completely alone, abandoned by everyone she had trusted and served. The discovery that so many people were risking their own positions to help her provided the first real hope she had felt since her ordeal began. The network's activities extended beyond simply providing Charlotte with protection and support. Members were working to gather evidence that could eventually clear her name and expose the conspiracy behind her exile. This investigation required careful coordination and extreme discretion, as discovery could result in criminal charges for those involved. One of the most significant breakthroughs came when Kevin Morrison successfully retrieved deleted files from palace computer systems that showed the original, unaltered financial records. These documents proved conclusively that Charlotte had never misused charitable funds and that all expenses charged to her accounts were legitimate and properly authorized. The evidence also revealed the identity of individuals who had accessed and modified the records. Sarah Walsh had been working to identify potential witnesses who might be willing to testify about the conspiracy if legal proceedings were ever initiated. Her careful cultivation of relationships with current palace staff had yielded several individuals who were prepared to risk their careers to expose the truth. These witnesses possessed first-hand knowledge of meetings where Charlotte's removal was planned and discussed. The network's legal advisor was Patricia Holbrook, a former palace counsel who had resigned in protest when asked to participate in the cover-up of Charlotte's frame-up. Patricia's expertise in both royal law and constitutional matters provided crucial guidance on how to properly document evidence and identify potential legal remedies for Charlotte's situation. As weeks passed, the network's activities became increasingly sophisticated and effective. They established protocols for monitoring media coverage, tracking the movements of those suspected of involvement in the conspiracy, and maintaining secure communications with sympathetic individuals still working within the royal household. The emotional toll of the situation was enormous for all involved, but particularly for Charlotte. Despite the support of the network, she struggled with the loss of her identity and purpose. The charitable work that had defined her life was no longer possible, and the public role that had given her meaning was permanently closed to her. James found himself serving not just as a protector, but as a counselor and friend during her darkest moments. The turning point came when the network received intelligence that palace officials were planning to escalate their campaign against Charlotte. New, more serious allegations were being prepared that would permanently destroy any possibility of her rehabilitation or return to public life. The network faced a crucial decision: continue operating in secret while gathering evidence, or take more direct action to protect Charlotte and expose the conspiracy. James advocated for immediate action, arguing that allowing the palace to continue its attack on Charlotte was morally unacceptable regardless of the personal consequences for network members. His position was supported by Margaret and several other key figures who felt that the time for quiet resistance had passed. The decision to go public with their evidence and accusations would transform the situation from a private struggle into a full-scale confrontation with the royal establishment. Network members understood that this escalation would likely end their careers and possibly result in criminal prosecution, but they also recognized that Charlotte's complete destruction was unacceptable. Preparations for the public revelation began immediately, with network members working around the clock to organize evidence, prepare statements, and coordinate with media contacts who might be willing to investigate and report their claims. The operation required military-level planning and execution to ensure maximum impact while protecting the safety of all involved. As the third phase of this extraordinary story concluded, James and the network prepared for a battle that would test their courage, challenge the royal establishment, and potentially change the British monarchy forever. The quiet rebellion was about to become a very public war, with Charlotte's honor and the network's principles at stake. The consequences of their decision to fight would extend far beyond their individual lives and careers. The decision to expose the conspiracy against Princess Charlotte required careful timing and coordination with trusted media contacts. Margaret Thornfield had cultivated relationships with several investigative journalists over her years in royal service, and she reached out to those she believed would handle the sensitive information responsibly and thoroughly. Rebecca Morrison of The Guardian had been covering royal affairs for 15 years and had built a reputation for meticulous fact-checking and ethical reporting. When Margaret approached her with the network's evidence, Rebecca initially expressed skepticism about the allegations. However, after reviewing the documented proof of financial manipulation and witnessing testimony from network members, she agreed to investigate the story fully. The network provided Rebecca with access to Kevin Morrison's recovered computer files, Sarah Walsh's detailed records of conversations and meetings, and Patricia Holbrook's legal analysis of the constitutional implications of Charlotte's treatment. The evidence was overwhelming and compelling, but Rebecca understood that publishing such explosive allegations would require multiple independent confirmations and legal review. James played a crucial role in the media strategy by agreeing to serve as the public face of the network's allegations. His military background and Years of distinguished service gave him credibility that would be difficult for palace officials to dismiss. More importantly, his decision to resign in protest provided powerful symbolic weight to the accusations against the royal establishment. The network's media campaign was coordinated with surgical precision. Rebecca's investigation would be published simultaneously with supporting stories from allies in other news organizations. Television interviews with James and other network members were scheduled to provide immediate follow-up coverage, while social media campaigns would amplify the story and engage public support. Charlotte herself was initially reluctant to participate actively in the public relations effort. The trauma of her exile had left her emotionally fragile, and the prospect of further media attention was deeply frightening. However, as she learned more about the evidence the network had gathered, she began to understand that public vindication might be the only way to reclaim her life and reputation. The palace's response to the impending media storm was swift and predictable. Royal communications staff worked frantically to prepare counter-narratives and damage control strategies. Legal teams were mobilized to threaten lawsuits and injunctions against news organizations preparing to publish the network's allegations. Most concerning for Charlotte and her supporters, palace security began investigating current staff members suspected of supporting the network. 3 days before the planned publication of Rebecca's investigation, the network received warning that palace officials had identified several current staff members who were providing information and support. David Chun coordinated an emergency evacuation plan that moved these individuals to safe locations while protecting their identities and future employment prospects. The palace's attempts at intimidation backfired spectacularly when Kevin Morrison released audio recordings of palace officials threatening and attempting to bribe current staff members to provide false testimony against Charlotte. These recordings, which clearly demonstrated consciousness of guilt and willingness to engage in witness tampering, provided additional evidence of the conspiracy and further undermined the palace's credibility. On the morning of November 15th, Rebecca Morrison's investigation was published simultaneously across multiple platforms, supported by extensive documentation and corroborating evidence. The story revealed not only the conspiracy against Charlotte, but also the broader culture of manipulation and political calculation within the royal household that had made such a conspiracy possible. James appeared on morning television programs to discuss his decision to resign and support Charlotte publicly. His interviews were carefully prepared to focus on the evidence rather than personal attacks, and his military bearing and obvious sincerity made a powerful impression on viewers. When hostile interviewers attempted to portray him as a disgruntled former employee, James calmly referred to the documented evidence and challenged them to explain how such comprehensive proof could be fabricated. The public response to the revelations was immediate and overwhelming. Social media exploded with expressions of support for Charlotte and condemnation of the palace's actions. Hashtags supporting Charlotte and praising James's courage trended globally within hours of the story's publication. More importantly, politicians from across the political spectrum began calling for official investigations into the allegations. Palace officials initially attempted to dismiss the allegations as the work of disgruntled former employees seeking attention and financial gain. However, this strategy quickly collapsed when additional evidence emerged and more current staff members came forward to confirm the network's claims. The palace's credibility suffered further damage when their initial denials were proven false by documentary evidence. Charlotte's first public statement since her exile was carefully crafted to express gratitude for the support while maintaining dignity and restraint. She avoided personal attacks on family members or palace officials, instead focusing on her commitment to truth and justice. The statement's measured tone and obvious sincerity contrasted sharply with the palace's increasingly desperate attempts at damage control. The legal implications of the scandal quickly became apparent as calls mounted for criminal investigations into the financial manipulation and conspiracy. Patricia Holbrook's constitutional analysis suggested that Charlotte's treatment might have violated both statutory law and constitutional principles governing the monarchy's relationship with Parliament and the public. International media attention intensified the pressure on the royal family to respond substantively to the allegations. Foreign correspondents who covered British affairs began investigating similar patterns of behavior in other royal controversies, raising questions about whether Charlotte's case was part of a broader pattern of manipulation and abuse of power. The network's success in exposing the conspiracy created new challenges and opportunities. Public support for Charlotte was strong, but translating that support into meaningful change required sustained political and legal pressure. The network began working with sympathetic members of parliament and legal experts to explore formal mechanisms for Charlotte's rehabilitation and accountability for those responsible for her persecution. James found himself thrust into an unexpected role as spokesman and advocate for Charlotte and the principles that had motivated his resignation. His articulate defense of conscience over duty resonated with military veterans and civil servants who understood the difficulty of his position. Speaking engagements and interview requests poured in from around the world, giving him a platform to advocate for Charlotte and challenge institutional corruption more broadly. The palace's response evolved from denial to damage control to grudging acknowledgement of mistakes in Charlotte's case. However, palace officials continued to resist calls for Charlotte's full rehabilitation or accountability for those responsible for her persecution. This continued resistance maintained public pressure and prevented the scandal from fading from media attention. Charlotte herself began to emerge from the isolation and depression that had characterized her early exile. The public support and validation of her experiences provided crucial psychological relief, while the network's protection allowed her to engage more actively in planning her future. For the first time since her ordeal began, Charlotte could envision a path forward that preserved her dignity and principles. The fourth phase of this remarkable story demonstrated the power of principled resistance and careful documentation in challenging institutional corruption. James's decision to sacrifice his career for his principles had catalyzed a movement that exposed systematic abuse of power and created momentum for meaningful reform. However, the ultimate resolution of Charlotte's case and the broader questions about accountability and justice remained uncertain as the battle entered its most critical phase. The public exposure of the conspiracy had fundamentally changed the dynamics of Charlotte's situation, but the royal establishment retained considerable power and resources to resist change. The final phase of this extraordinary story would determine whether truth and justice could prevail against centuries of institutional privilege and protection. The parliamentary inquiry into Princess Charlotte's treatment was announced on December 3rd, following weeks of intense public pressure and political maneuvering. The Select Committee on Constitutional Affairs, chaired by the respected cross-party MP Eleanor Davies, was granted unprecedented access to palace records and personnel in what became the most thorough investigation of royal conduct in modern British history. James was among the first witnesses called to testify before the committee. His appearance in the oak-paneled committee room drew massive media attention, with every major news organization providing live coverage of his testimony. Dressed in his best civilian suit, but carrying himself with military bearing, James presented the committee with a detailed timeline of events and a comprehensive analysis of the evidence gathered by the network. His testimony was compelling not only for its factual content, but for the obvious sincerity and moral conviction he displayed. When committee members pressed him about his motivations for resigning and supporting Charlotte, James spoke eloquently about the difference between loyalty to institutions and loyalty to principles. His words resonated far beyond a committee room, inspiring discussions about conscience, duty, and moral courage in organizations across British society. Charlotte's own testimony before the committee was scheduled for December 18th, marking her first official public appearance since her exile. The weeks leading up to her testimony were filled with intensive preparation, as she worked with legal advisors to ensure her statements would be both truthful and strategically effective in clearing her name. The day of Charlotte's testimony dawned cold and gray, but hundreds of supporters gathered outside the Houses of Parliament to demonstrate their support. Many carried signs reading "Truth and Justice for Charlotte" and "Thank you, Captain Mitchell," acknowledging the role James's courage had played in bringing her story to light. Charlotte's appearance before the committee was a masterclass in dignity under pressure. Dressed simply but elegantly, she answered every question with honesty and precision, methodically dismantling the false allegations that had been used to justify her exile. Her composure was remarkable given the personal cost of the ordeal she had endured, and her obvious integrity made a powerful impression on both committee members and the watching public. The most dramatic moment of Charlotte's testimony came when she was presented with the original financial records recovered by Kevin Morrison. As she reviewed documents that proved her innocence conclusively, tears rolled down her face for the first time during the proceedings. The emotion was genuine and powerful, humanizing Charlotte in a way that years of formal royal appearances never could have achieved. Following Charlotte's testimony, the committee heard from a parade of palace officials, including several who had been directly involved in the conspiracy against her. Under oath and facing potential perjury charges, many of these individuals provided testimony that contradicted their previous public statements and revealed additional details about the campaign to destroy Charlotte's reputation. The committee's final report, published on January 27th, was a scathing indictment of palace culture and a complete vindication of Charlotte's character and conduct. The report found that Charlotte had been the victim of a systematic and malicious campaign of character assassination motivated by political considerations rather than genuine concerns about misconduct. Most significantly, the report recommended that Charlotte's title and royal status be restored immediately, with full acknowledgement that her exile had been unjustified and harmful. The committee also recommended criminal investigations into several palace officials who had participated in the conspiracy, along with comprehensive reforms to prevent similar abuses in the future. The royal family's response to the parliamentary report was carefully crafted to minimize further damage while acknowledging the gravity of the situation. In an unprecedented statement, the Queen personally expressed regret for Charlotte's treatment and announced that she would be immediately restored to full royal status with enhanced protections against future persecution. Charlotte's restoration ceremony took place on February 14th, Valentine's Day, in a small private gathering that deliberately contrasted with the grandeur usually associated with royal events. James was among the invited guests, representing not only his personal relationship with Charlotte, but also the principles of courage and integrity that had made her vindication possible. The ceremony was emotional for everyone involved, but particularly for Charlotte, who received back the royal insignia that had been stripped from her months earlier. Her statement following the ceremony emphasized forgiveness rather than revenge, focusing on lessons learned and the importance of protecting others who might face similar persecution in the future. James's role in Charlotte's vindication earned him widespread recognition and numerous honors. Military veterans organizations, civil rights groups, and ethics organizations celebrated his courage in choosing principle over career security. However, James consistently deflected praise to the network of supporters who had made Charlotte's vindication possible. The criminal investigations recommended by the parliamentary committee resulted in several prosecutions and resignations within the royal household. While some of the most senior figures involved escaped formal charges due to their positions, their careers were effectively ended by the scandal, and comprehensive reforms were implemented to prevent similar abuses. Charlotte's return to royal duties was carefully managed to ensure her safety and well-being while maximizing the positive impact of her rehabilitation. Her first official engagement was a visit to the refugee housing project that had triggered the original conspiracy against her, symbolically demonstrating that she would not be intimidated into abandoning her principles. The relationship between James and Charlotte evolved significantly during and after her vindication. While maintaining appropriate boundaries given their different positions, they developed a deep friendship based on mutual respect and shared values. James eventually accepted a position as Charlotte's senior security advisor, allowing him to continue protecting someone he deeply respected while maintaining his integrity and principles. The network that had supported Charlotte during her darkest hours continued to operate after her vindication, but with a different mission. Instead of providing covert support to a persecuted individual, they worked to implement the reforms recommended by the parliamentary committee and to support other royal household staff who faced ethical dilemmas in their work. Margaret Thornfield was appointed to a new position as Royal Ethics Advisor, with responsibility for ensuring that the lessons learned from Charlotte's case were incorporated into palace procedures and training. Her appointment sent a clear message that the institutional culture that had enabled Charlotte's persecution was being systematically reformed. The broader impact of Charlotte's vindication extended far beyond the royal family and palace staff. The case became a touchstone for discussions about institutional accountability, the protection of whistleblowers, and the importance of individual moral courage in confronting organizational corruption. James's decision to resign in protest and support Charlotte publicly inspired similar acts of conscience in other organizations and institutions. His story was studied in military academies, business schools, and ethics courses as an example of principled leadership and moral courage under pressure. Charlotte's charitable work resumed with renewed vigor and enhanced public support. Her experience of persecution and vindication gave her a unique perspective on justice and fairness that enhanced her effectiveness as an advocate for vulnerable populations. The housing project for refugees that had triggered her original persecution became a model for similar initiatives across Europe. The final resolution of this extraordinary story demonstrated the power of individual courage to catalyze institutional change. James's decision to follow his conscience rather than protocol had set in motion a series of events that not only vindicated Charlotte, but also reformed the royal household and inspired countless others to stand up for their principles. Years later, as James reflected on the events that had transformed both his life and Charlotte's, he remained convinced that he had made the right choice. The cost of his decision had been significant. The end of his military career, months of uncertainty and stress, and permanent changes to his relationship with institutions he had once served loyally. However, the benefits extended far beyond his personal satisfaction with having done the right thing. Charlotte's vindication had preserved the career and reputation of someone who had dedicated her life to serving others. The reforms implemented in response to her case had protected future royal household staff from similar persecution. Most importantly, the entire episode had demonstrated that even the most powerful institutions could be held accountable when individuals had the courage to stand up for truth and justice. The story of Captain James Mitchell and Princess Charlotte became a modern parable about the importance of moral courage and the power of principled resistance to institutional corruption. Their experience proved that individuals acting on conscience could challenge even the most entrenched systems of power and privilege, creating positive change that extended far beyond their own lives and circumstances. In the end, James's decision to choose duty to conscience over duty to institution had not only saved Charlotte's reputation and career, but had also helped create a more just and accountable royal household. The price of his courage had been high, but the value of his example would inspire others for generations to come.